All right, sweet. So 2-3 minutes in, while people are trickling in, first of all, a big thank you from me to all of those who put this event together. Alan and Toby, by no means the only ones I know, and I have seen so much great discussion already today. A special call out actually to Yi Ting Lee, speaking on a very similar subject, and Deepak from Atlassian, who dived into the technical side and really showed us some beautiful data viz on there. I've seen quite a few familiar names and faces, and a lot of you will know TI is still quite a small world. So whenever we do these things, even at the scale of the webinars that we do at Armstrong Craven, I just get so much out of it because it's really, I think, just nice to be in a room virtually with a load of people who actually understand what it is I and my team do. I gave up explaining this to strangers, let alone to my mum, years ago. And so I have a feeling there are some people joining who will feel the same way. Now, something that, on that note, something you could do for me actually at some point during this session, particularly since I've just seen the Career Pathways session has been cancelled, which is a shame. If you could drop into the chat in a couple of words how it was that you personally got into TI. That's something that I'm always really fascinated by, the journeys people have taken to get here. And mine was completely typical, really, in that it's been far from a straight line. So I'm really interested to hear how you found your way. So for those that I haven't met, first thing, my name is Elizabeth Birrell. I'm the Director of Insight and Talent Analytics at Armstrong Craven, which means I run the TI consulting group within a larger talent research business. I joined about 8 years ago, but Armstrong Craven has been in this world now for over 30 years. And our team made that transition, as others here will have done just exactly the same move, from really being a back office function that supported talent acquisition with research to delivering bespoke insight directly to end clients. However, while we are a supplier, I promise a load of this content is directly relevant to those of you for whom your end client is an internal client in TA and HR, as opposed to our end external clients. I'm going to stay really focused on whoever your client might be. Here's the way that we do, but during that journey, along the way, we've worked with many of the biggest companies in the world: tech, financial services, healthcare, consumer and industrial, hopefully something for everybody. And along the way, we've gained what I think is still really a unique insight into what clients know about TI, what they need from TI, and how critically important it really is. All the challenges that talent acquisition in particular faces, I think, can be better understood through the lens of good talent intelligence: who and how and where and when to hire and what should we pay, talent supply and demand, what the candidates want and expect, how are our competitors hiring, how well does our EVP work in any talent pool, every facet of TA, and a lot, I think, of HR as well. For HR listeners, can really just be supercharged by this data. And there is still a huge amount to do, which I like to think makes this an exciting industry, maybe an exciting micro industry, and also an exciting time to be in it. Now, I've joined today to talk about how we are applying TI methodology to DE&I, to building representative teams, and particularly at a senior level. Now, conscious of who I'm speaking to here, what I'm not going to do is make the case for representative teams or difference or representation at leadership level or a culture of belonging, because the data is very much in. As you will all already be well aware, representative teams make more resilient, more innovative, and ultimately more productive businesses or business units. And our clients, whether internal or external, I believe on the whole, they know that too, which is why this is just becoming a more and more urgent mandate for us for decades now, and it isn't going away, because while the case has been made, we will all still see out there that there is a huge amount of equity work left to do, particularly at those senior levels. Just going to skip you on. Here we go. So we've had the pleasure then of seeing DE&I work in TA really gather momentum. And I've come to think of this as something as a virtuous cycle. We hire leaders from underrepresented groups, whatever that means in our particular industry, at our particular level, in our particular place. And we build representation and motivate others to join that team or excel in that team and step forward for advancement. And in that way, I like to think that a little progress means a lot. Often the sentiment that I hear from clients is that there's pressure on them and their teams to build representation, but at the same time, they face a real lack of clarity about what that actually means, about what success might look like and what a feasible objective looks like for their teams. And that uncertainty can make it difficult to get started, can make it difficult to maintain momentum, and it can make it difficult to celebrate achievement as well. So, well, celebrate achievement, celebrate success, I could say. It can also make it difficult to recognize failure. Good TI then can help talent acquisition teams and ultimately HR leaders to solve all 4 of those problems. That's get started, keep going, reward progress, and diagnose underperformance. That is, hello Jackie, hello Mark. That is, that's really the point where we come in. So we support clients and drive our own agenda here at AC to build a representative team by using external labour market data to do 3 things. That's set targets that are ambitious but achievable, by which I mean we want to lead our industry. We don't want to give our teams an impossible task to carry out, and also to establish what representation actually means in each case. And that one I think is sometimes overlooked in DE&I work in TA, but isn't that the critical measure of success here? So finally, our work then is to make recommendations to turn this into actionable insight, which is here's what success looks like, here's how far you have to go, and then also here's how we suggest you close that gap. And Yeating actually from Micron actually just did a really interesting session an hour or so ago on setting goals in particular. So if you were not in that breakout session, I'd highly recommend nipping back to listen to that if you haven't. She made a really astute point that got me thinking, no time to react to it, but I'm thinking who should be in these rooms within business when these decisions get made. For who we are, our background in this is that for decades now, clients have asked our search and talent pipelining part of the business to help them find candidates from underrepresented groups, usually scarce senior roles. And before we kick off, before we make that promise to a client, we're doing our own feasibility checks, of course, not just to see what's possible in this talent pool, this region at this level. So that's that ambitious but achievable, but also what our goal looks like. So what does representation mean here? Now, sometimes that's really straightforward. Our earlier inclusion work largely focused on women, so women in leadership roles in traditionally male-dominated industries. So at the time I'm talking about, that would be FS and tech, where I know huge strides have been made, but also in industrial, oil and gas, engineering, transportation, heavy manufacturing, where there is really still a huge amount of work to do. Representation in that case, at least regions where there isn't significant exclusion of women from the workforce, as in parts of the developing world still, look like 50%. So a business where 50% of senior leaders are women, where 50% of professionals, including in technical roles, are women, where women are hired at an equal rate and advance at an equal rate. And if that sounds like old hat, as the work of DE&I has certainly expanded since then, I think it's worth recalling that as I speak today, less than 5% of Fortune's global 500 companies have female CEOs. Now, elsewhere from that 50%, it really is a lot more complex to define representative, which I would argue is just the first step to any meaningful change. When you're considering culture or ethnicity, demographic data for the region you're hiring in is a factor, of course, and that's where national statistical data helps us. Although, as a lot of you will know already, even that really has its quirks. Just look at Germany. And education data gets us a few steps further. Again, Deepak did something brilliant using exactly that education data in his session earlier. That's graduate numbers by discipline where we can get them, enrollment numbers by discipline where we can't, and then thinking of that external client, the diversity of our consumer base is important too, particularly in that consumer facing business. Now, knowing how diverse the city you're hiring in is or isn't used to be a really important first step, but a complicating factor now, which I'm sure everyone in this room is working on in some area of your roles, is that remote working has allowed a lot of industries to broaden the search, at least in certain roles, meaning search region really isn't just about commute to the site, it's also about salaries and cost of living and inevitably representation. Levels of flex and fully remote working have begun to normalise, at least where I am here in the UK, dropping down from mid-COVID's massive high, but probably never now returning to that pre-COVID low. And that's created chaos, as you'd expect. and a critical mass of think pieces about the return to the office, and also, I've written one, for example, and also opportunity. Can we put this role somewhere where we could attract applications from individuals in historically excluded or marginalized groups for this team, for this function, for this business? And I'd go so far as to say that's a challenge we should be taking to every role where it makes sense. Why wouldn't we be flexible here? Why wouldn't we use this vacancy to open doors to leaders who can make our exec team more representative, either of the region we're operating in or the consumer base we're serving? A lot of DE&I work is long-term. It's the tie-up with universities. It's increasing exposure of new graduates to your industry. It's working with and promoting your internal advocates. It's developing your ERGs and then empowering those. And that work is not just worthwhile, it's critical, but you might not see the results during your time in role. So whether our opportunities to do good work at a stroke, good TI gives us the evidence base that makes that case. So having defined then what representation looks like, that's what our goal is, we then need to understand the starting line, not just how diverse is our current function, leadership team, organization, but what's the state of the industry? How are we performing against our peers? This kind of benchmarking is often data that's never been available to our end client before, and it tells them how far it is to go, as well as what an industry leading position looks like. Because, of course, it's possible to be a long way from truly representative, however we've defined it, and still lead your peer set in diversity levels across all those measures that count, which is not just headcount, but hiring and early careers and advancement and exco, so your leadership layer. Now, just in case that wasn't enough to make the case for TI driving equity work, I think it's important to acknowledge where we're at. In our working lives, we've seen a distinct shift I've observed from female representation to other underrepresented groups. Culture and ethnicity is a huge focus area, and from a UK perspective, still a massive amount to do. For example, in 2021, there were no Black CEOs, no Black chairs, no Black CFOs in the entire FTSE 100. And according to Origins, a classification system designed by Richard Webber, which I'd really encourage you to check out, the lineup was no more diverse overall than when the analysis started nearly 10 years ago. In Australia, North America, the Aboriginal and Indigenous and First Nations representation levels in prominent positions is even lower than this. And then a more recent shift is that clients are also looking at building diverse teams in other ways that I think are more complex again. So this year alone, we have seen a huge spike in interest in understanding how equity work can focus on members of the LGBTQ community and on people living and working with disabilities, particularly neurodiversity. Region by region, role by role, that introduces more complexity again to the question of, well, what would representation look like here? What's our goal? Now, we have pretty solid data in most of Western Europe. In the UK, for example, 71% of Gen Z identify as straight compared to 91% of baby boomers. In the US, good data, pockets of good data in Eastern Europe and in Southeast Asia, but elsewhere, as you'll be well aware, there is a huge cultural and political element, a barrier really when it comes to transparency about questions of identity. Now, in most cases, sticking with that additional layer of complexity here, in most cases, we can build a persona to understand the number of people who present as female, for example, or for people who likely belong to a particular ethnic group by understanding the background, the region, the history. But it's a very different thing to try to understand questions of identity or community in that context. And that is the frontier that I would say we are facing now, with an established methodology for designing representation in terms of gender and ethnicity, and testing an emerging methodology for doing that same work to define representation in terms of identity, sexuality, and disability. I'm going to give you a minute because I've done a logos slide. Everybody likes a logos slide. So how are we doing it? Let's say we land on a figure for meaningful representation that we're happy with. That's our goal. How do we start using the tools we have to decide what's feasible when it comes to identification and approach and hiring self-identified members of these communities? If, like us, you're using AI or machine learning enabled sourcing software, some examples are on this slide, either to search professional communities or to build and encode the personas your teams will use to do that, you need some benchmarks. Now, this is old-fashioned, but the best way to start to understand who's leading the market here is still desk research, secondary data. It's awards and events and conference speakerships and press coverage, not just press releases, and ERGs, both their existence and their membership and autonomy and activity levels. And what that secondary data allows us to do is focus the lens on a small group of businesses which appear to be high performing at hiring and promoting, for example, people living and working with disabilities within their organisation. That gives us a sample so we can ask the question, what are the characteristics of a high performing organisation? What clues should we be looking for on a company level within talent competitors or sources of talent? What interesting correlations exist here? From that set of characteristics, you're able to expand the shortlist where your high performers are, for example, established software companies with East Coast US headquarters, high startup exposure, relationships with in the UK Stonewall or GLAD, and a strong intake of under 25s. The next step would be to go away and find a dozen more, 50 more that fit that pattern. Next, of course, we'd look at talent. So what does a qualifying profile look like according to self-identification? What characteristics does that profile have? And that is where we start to see more interesting patterns emerge, and also where we should start to take note of the potential for unintended consequences. So, for example, people who self-identify as not straight or as members of the broader LGBTQIA plus community skew younger, as we've heard, while people who would self-identify as disabled skew older. And across both those groups, individuals are more likely to have been born in North America or in Western Europe. Now, it's important to be transparent that we are never, I think any of us, going to conduct research on the scale required to challenge the numbers that the secondary research gives us, even without that complicating factor of the political climate in which we find candidates in many of the regions in which we search. But what we are able to do is compare like with like across the industries or companies of interest, and then offer actionable insight and recommendations. That's at which level to hire, in which companies or industries will have better luck building a representative team, whether that's to welcome more neurodiverse individuals or to properly represent all the communities that we serve within our customer base or consumer base. Now, there is a second string to all this, which I believe is perhaps more unique to the work that we are able to do as a third party and cannot always be reproduced in a compliant way in-house, even by the most sophisticated TI groups, and that is primary insight. Primary insight capability represents roughly half of the headcount of my team today. Primary simply because it's data being gathered for the first time for this purpose. And that is because it isn't enough just to understand what representation means for any individual role, or even how we are performing as a business, as an industry, and against our peers, our talent competitors. Really, what our clients, whether internal or external, want TI to tell them is, given how far we have to go, how do we move the needle now? And we found that the secondary data alone just isn't enough to tell that story. Now, an ethical and compliant primary data approach identifies individuals in the relevant talent pool for in-depth structured conversations. We're treating them effectively as talent research respondents who, as they aren't in process and aren't speaking to hiring managers at a named organization, are more likely to give us a transparent and unbiased look at their experiences. Now, in the case of equity work, our job really is to understand the experience of individuals from underrepresented or historically marginalized groups, whatever that means in the function or the region we're looking at, and how that differs from their majority peers. So this might include standard themes like salary and benefits data, EVP, attraction strategy, recruitment approaches, how and where they look for jobs, understanding their network strength and network links, but it should also create an action plan really for future recruitment. Now, in the past, we've had great success with actionable insight that is ready to implement here. So in one role, female respondents had very strong preferences regarding location that did not echo those of their male peers. In another UK project, BAME respondents were uniquely more likely to look for and find jobs within their personal networks, while white respondents were more likely to turn to professional social media or industry job boards, specific job boards first. It's also, I think, powerful and really instructive on these calls for the team to be able to learn about the negative experiences that individuals have had with recruitment approaches, if only so that we know what not to do in order to create a recruitment experience which is tailored to be attractive and not othering or alienating to exactly the individuals that we are working to welcome into our organizations. Ultimately, our work isn't to source or to identify, it is to count what counts. What does success look like? What is possible for our teams to achieve? What's the best way forward? So with that in mind, and nearly 10 minutes to go, I'd like to close by sharing the recommendation that we as a team make most frequently in projects like these, based on all the data that we have discussed today. So first, and maybe most important, is to go back to the role profile or job description and check that it only contains what it really needs to contain. It can be effective to sit down with the hiring or line manager and just start again, stripping out everything in the template so you can focus on what is critical. What experience or characteristics or qualifications can't we live without? We often find that over time, these things become freighted with unintentional bias, with exclusions that are based on assumptions that might be out of date or even might actively work against our aims when it comes to building representative teams. An example, if somebody is in a relevant role today, do they really need to be graduates of an Ivy League or red brick university or ex-Big Four? As you'll be well aware, these institutions have their own representation work to do. So by tying ourselves to one particular background for a role, using that, I think, as a shorthand for quality, we tie ourselves as well to the demographic that's associated with that background. And we miss out on the opportunity to capture, arguably, I would say, the most exciting candidates of all for our end client, which is anyone from a non-traditional background for this role that has successfully broken into the field and excelled. The same applies to educational background, particularly when we're looking at experienced candidates. If somebody is senior in a relevant role with a competitor today and is high potential, should we exclude them because they don't have a master's degree? And have we fully considered the consequences of that choice? A really powerful use of TI I've found is to show internal stakeholders how, with a simple click of a button to remove one filter, we can grow our potential talent pool from a few to a few hundred. Now, that's really it from me. I've tried to hold a little time for questions in the chat or for others to share their experience. So if I may, I will nip into Q&A. I'll open the floor and take a look at the questions in the chat now. Thank you to those who have given us an intro to how they got into TI as well. For me, I started life as a copywriter and went into building a social listening, social media platform that was eventually acquired, went back to university, briefly became a librarian, joined Armstrong Craven straight after that experience, and from there to here. But what I've found about the journeys people take is that my feeling is none of them are linear. We have an HR cohort, I think, and a recruitment cohort. This is why I was really looking forward to the Career Paths into TI session. But there are some of us, I think, who've come from nowhere even tangentially related to talent and had a lot of makeup work to do between there and here. My hello, incidentally, earlier was the very person who hired me into this role, who jumped on the chat a little minute ago, and there's a member of my team in there as well. So that's exciting to see. Any questions? I'm in the Q&A. So do you find that clients, line managers, are receptive to reviewing candidate requirements? And do you have a method for easing them towards it? So I think receptiveness here depends a lot on the level of the role we're looking at. It is much easier to say, look, this person is senior, they've got 10, 15 years of great experience, they're with a talent competitor that we really rate for this function. Let's give that individual a shot. Or more accurately, I think these days, as we build our persona ready to do this work in a semi-automated way, at least at first, let's exclude that requirement and see what we get. As we get closer to entry level, I think line managers in particular are more likely to use something like a degree or prior FS experience as a shorthand for, we're going to get 300 applications, we're going to get 500 or 1,000 names for this role. We need to whittle it down somehow. What's the easiest measure of quality I can think of? this group of universities, or has a master's, even though it probably technically isn't required for the role. And that is where we certainly have hit the sticking point. Why wouldn't they have this or that? Why wouldn't we narrow the field by saying, let's look at our Big Four, ex-Big Four or ex-consulting candidates first? And the most effective way that we've ever found of easing them towards this is to show them, ideally in the platform, in the tech that you use to take these counts, or as close as you can get to it in a client situation, depending on if you're third party. Look how small the talent pool is when we run this for the first time. And this is automated. So we're stripping out individuals we will therefore never see, who, if they were in front of you, could be fantastic. Like example, Ms. S and Mr. X. We can show how that number goes from very, very small for a narrow search, including some filters that I would argue are not necessary in this case, to a very, very big number. But I think we've got to give them value back to ask them to take that journey with us. And the value that we try to give back is, now let's implement a better filter for quality, a filter for quality that directly relates to this work. So not just cybersecurity, but penetration testing and the whole bundle of related keywords that are associated with that. That's directly relevant to this role. That will make them better, quicker. They'll be better at understanding what our work is, what our industry is, what our company is doing. That, I think, allows them to see that they get something by giving something, when they sacrifice that quick shorthand for, I just want to see the best. If we can help them to define best in a way that better suits the requirement, I think particularly for line managers, that is motivating and exciting to them. Now, over in TA and HR, I think DE&I is still a sell here, in that we are looking at a more representative slate if we exclude filters A and B in favor of something that is directly role, skills or competencies related. Just check the chat as well. Oh, good question from Alan about corporate DE&I teams. I'm conscious I have gone over time. In short, we have had one or two clients over the years who were DE&I directly in role. Mostly we work with HR and TA. I would love to do more work directly into that part of the organization. I think sometimes in the HR silo, we don't make the best use of the data that is available to us. And a particular frustration for me and my team often is that HR analytics, workforce planning, people analytics is going on elsewhere in the business, and our stakeholder in TA is not able to get that data. They will have data that allows us to do a better benchmark than approaching the company as an external party. And so a little encouragement, if you're TA or HR, to use what you have in people analytics, in workforce planning, and to get cozy with the teams that hold all of that data, because we would love to see more of that. TI would love to see and use more of that when we do go out to market to look to build representative teams. Great question. Thank you very much.